We've actually got proof, the actual proof that you and I are all related. Really excited tonight. My guest, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, who is a writer, a scientist, a researcher, an author, and speaker on these issues that I think are really foundational if you think about it. For example, the conversation we're going to have tonight, proof that we're all related. And I want him to talk about this. Is it possible that we are all related? What if we're not all related? What does that mean? I mean, what would the implications be of there not really being a first Adam? Does that mean that Jesus Christ wasn't really the last Adam? So the conversation we're going to end up going into tonight is actually really foundational to the truth of understanding a proper interpretation of the gospel and what the gospel is. But my guest tonight, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson with Answers in Genesis. Thank you so much for joining me, sir. How are you tonight?
Very good. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you and your audience.
Well, I am thrilled that you are here, and I know you guys are going to love Dr. Jeanson because not only is he brilliant, but he can communicate in a way that's like, oh, I get that. That makes sense to me. So I really, really appreciate that. You have been studying for how long now? I was studying specifically, creation and this your field.
Well, the short version of a longer story is I grew up under creation ministry and remember John Morris of ICR giving a dinosaur talk and playing a sound of a dinosaur when I was junior high, elementary, I don't remember, but it was probably a homeschool convention. I remember going to Worldview Weekend in Wisconsin. I grew up in Wisconsin. Ken Ham was speaking. I found my old notes from that
Wow.
a couple of years ago. Have you been evolutionized? That was the opening question I wrote down. What makes you think? And didn't intend when I went off to graduate school and undergraduate to go into creation ministry. My interest was cancer, so I went to Wisconsin Parkside, a branch of the system, studied life at the molecular level, molecular biology, and then went to graduate school at Harvard because they had the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and lots of opportunity for medical research there. That was my intention. And halfway through there, sort of had a change of purpose, focus, maybe a conversion experience. I don't know what the right description is, but then began to ask questions, how can I use my training for more immediate eternal application? Explored overseas missions, all sorts of things. Ended up as an experiment, because I guess once you become a scientist, everything in life becomes an experiment.
That's beautiful. I love it.
Sent a resume to the Institute for Creation Research in 2009. So was there about 6 years. I came to Answers in Genesis in 2015. So overall, it's been about 10 years in full-time creation research. And much of that time, at least the first half, was focused intensely on the broader question of the origin of species. And it just so happens that our species is one of the best studied at the genetic level of all species alive today. Aside from some bacteria, humans are probably the most studied, and for understandable reasons. The funding structure, at least in the United States, and the tax structure and baby boomers wanting to get cures for their diseases as they grow older, puts a lot of money into understanding the genetic basis for disease. So there's a lot of freely available genetic data out there, and the focus as of late has turned heavily to the question of human genetics, human history, testable predictions, a concept we can talk about at some point, and confirmations of the biblical model in the realm of human genetics and human history.
It begs the question, if you will, did you really, after growing up in a Christian home, you went to all this secular evolutionary education, and yet you still were able to learn the science, not adopt an evolutionary world? You went through all that without being persuaded that maybe they're right. I mean, was there any time in there that you were like, I wonder, or was it like, no, I saw through the schemes and I saw through that?
I'd say no, and I want to have that conversation, so I'm going to make it a short one, because I get asked it a lot, and I think it's a critical question, and I just was reading something lately that reinforced it to me. But the question, I guess, that I'm going to rephrase from you is, how do you survive, or how did you make it through Harvard, and what do I do as a parent? And there's a couple reasons it's especially relevant to me personally now. Is I just met some friends who moved here to the Creation Museum to work here, to get involved because of their own personal negative experience with their kids. we don't want to, we want to not repeat this. That's a sad side of it. The positive side perhaps is I've been rereading some of Richard Wurmbrandt's, or Wurmbrandt's, however you pronounce it, books. If you're not familiar with him, he was, I think, a Romanian Jewish Lutheran pastor who was able to escape after 14 years, I think, in communist Romanian prison. So you have to think this is back 1950s and 60s. I might have the dates wrong, but it's a generation or two back. But he was able to escape and basically tell the world, here's what's going on behind the Iron Curtain. Richard Wurmbrandt was a pastor, severely tortured, persecuted, and testified in Congress to what he endured, so that to give people a window into what was going on. Anyway, all that backstory to say, he has written books on basically, here's how I survived terror and the worst forms of persecution and maintained my testimony. And he talks about the underground church and how relevant apologetics is. So that was a long backstory to say, perhaps one of the last places you'd expect to find apologetics. When people are pulling out your fingernails and doing all sorts of other unmentionable tortures, what does the age of the earth have to do with that? Well, he talks about how the underground church is very adept and able to, and at that time, the foe was communist, and the communist system was atheistic, explicitly atheistic, and targeted youth for a purpose to keep them from becoming Christians. His parishioners, the people who were dedicated to Christ and evangelistic, they had to be ready to answer the communist atheistic argument. So as I'm seeing what's happening in our own country and the rapid decline and the rapid approach of persecution, I believe here, I don't even think that's even debatable anymore. It's a question of when, not if. You just look at what's being proposed in print for laws. There's a second reason for me personally that this concept is relevant. So people who've come because of negative experience, and then hear even Richard Wurmbrandt talking about how important it is. He wasn't writing a book on here's why apologetics is important. He was just describing here's how the underground church was doing their ministry. And it was being able to quickly answer the communist arguments, because that's what they deal with day in and day out, ministering to the Russian soldiers who came into Romania. Anyway, there's a long discussion, but when people ask, how did I make it through this? I'm not facing my fingernails being pulled out, but people need to know it is an assault. It is a direct assault on the Christian faith to go off to university. It was either God's Not Dead or God's Not Dead 2, one of those movies where the professor in the university is portrayed as very hostile. I remember watching that with a relative, and the relative said, they caricatured that guy. It was just too aggressive. I said, no, that was university. That's how it is today. There's no exaggeration there. You have to be prepared for it. One of the favorite references I like to cite is from a guy who's not necessarily young Earth, Marvin Olasky of World Magazine. He taught, though, at the university level in Texas, I think Texas, Austin, and wrote an article several years back, maybe a decade back, on advice to incoming students going off to secular college. And his advice was, expect to read double. This is really the point I wanted to make. Expect to read double if you want to survive. Any discipline in your university classroom is going to teach you the secular mindset. Literature, art, biology, chemistry, it doesn't matter. It's going to be secular. And if you want to understand the Christian worldview, you have to read just as much outside of class as in it. And so I grew up homeschooled through 8th grade, went to an explicitly young Earth school for high school. In a sense, I can look back and say that's where the reading double happened when I went off to university, and I was reading on the side while at university. I wasn't shocked by what I heard and could bring the arguments to the professors instead of being snowballed by stuff that caught me off guard. So that's the bottom line I'm driving at. It's relevant because we have negative examples right now. Persecution is coming, and apologetics is all the more relevant given those who've gone before us and suffered greatly for it. And one of the key ways to be prepared, and this is so the communists target the youth because they know if you can grab them, then you can keep them basically for the rest of your life, apart from the miraculous work of God. So here's a benefit we have that I grew up with, and the window for that benefit is rapidly closing. So I urge all parents, grandparents, make use of that window as quickly as you can.
Amen to that. It's interesting to see that in the face of pain or in the face of pleasure, which is what a lot of college students go off ready to, okay, I'm going to enjoy all these pleasures. Pain or pleasure, apologetics is incredibly, incredibly relevant. Well, I want to jump into your expertise here, genetics. I've been advertising this as proof that we are all related. And I've been praying that you're going to bring it, buddy. You've actually got something for us that's going to help us see this, right? I haven't been doing false advertising with this one.
I don't think so, but I'll let the viewers decide.
Well, I'm convinced we do have the evidence. Everything I've seen has been amazing, and you do such a good job of presenting it. Kick us off here with this whole understanding of when did science start to figure out that, oh my goodness, in this field of knowledge called genetics, there's some amazing information that has these conclusions we're going to come to.
I want to start with something that I think is a critical foundational point. Basically, the point I want to make now in a few slides is there's a lot of information out there that cannot tell you who you came from. And what I'm referring to is, at least in the US, I know there's plenty of advertisements, especially around holidays, for genetic testing companies. Wait till June, Father's Day, and you'll see sales for get your Y chromosome tested, or give the gift of ancestry to your relatives for Christmas, this sort of thing. Other countries perhaps not so much, but I've seen it enough, and I think that's a good segue into asking the question, what can we know about our past? And there's a whole lot less that's easy to figure out than what we're used to. So let's see if I can figure out the share.
So you're
screen.
saying the 23andMe, all those, they can't get back like what we're going to be talking about here.
Yes, and I want to narrow our discussion. I want to deal with the big picture and say much of the big picture is not going to be terribly relevant for either side, even though they push for it. Let's sweep away the fog and help laser focus on that which is most relevant and why it matters when we talk about Adam and Eve. So let's pretend this is my family tree, and I've put in black and white these hypothetical relatives up here near the top, and I've put in full color here this gentleman of African descent. And many people, let's say if you're of Caucasian heritage, want to know, do you have an African American in your ancestry? Do you have a Native American in your ancestry? Or if you're African American and viewing it, was I the descendant of a slave holder? Who is in my family tree? Could there be a Native American? Any ethnicity, do you want to know, is there someone else?
Yeah.
That's usually the question. And what I want to show you is it's a lot harder to answer that very simple question from just a few generations back. And so if we understand that part of the equation, we'll get a better perspective on the much deeper, longer term question of how to get back to Adam and Eve. So this first question is, can you detect this? Could I hypothetically detect an African man in my family tree? Let's say there is one, but I don't know it. And I go to Family Tree DNA, 23andMe, Ancestry.com, and I say, pay the money, give them a spit sample to get some DNA. Can they tell me whether or not I have an African descent person in my family tree? Let's think through generation by generation what the DNA is going to look like. So beginning with this gentleman, let's say there is an African in my family tree. The rest of my relatives are all, in this slide, Caucasian. So presumably this African man married a Caucasian lady. That means their children, if he marries a Caucasian lady, are going to be only 50% African. He's 100% African at the genetic level. His wife is going to be 100% Caucasian, but each of us receive half of our DNA from our parents. So maximally, you can be 50% of each. So this ancestor of mine, hypothetical ancestor, is only going to be 50% African. That ancestor, let's say, grows up, marries another person in my family tree, again, presumably a Caucasian. But this 50% African ancestor can only, again, contribute half. So 50 divided by 2 is 25. And every generation, then it drops by half. It's an exponential decay. So by the time you get to me, just 4 generations ago, that's not very long. I mean, it's like great-grandparents or so. I'd probably know it just from my family records. I wouldn't need DNA to do this. But let's say I don't know my family records, and I'm asking this question. In just 4 short generations, we're basically below the detection limit. If you do one of these tests, they don't tell you. Below 10% is usually not reliable for a variety of technical reasons, ranging from they don't look at your whole DNA to it's just hard because a lot of our DNA sequences are shared. So here we can make a side point about Adam and Eve. One of the challenges to identifying smoking gun signatures of ethnicities is a lot of our DNA is shared. You and me, Eric, can differ at a certain DNA position that I actually share with an African. And I'm not talking about this family tree being accurate. I'm just saying, pick a random sub-Saharan African man. I might have a number of DNA letters in common with him that differ between you and me, even though by external appearances, you and I look like we should be a closer DNA match. It's just the way it works out. There's a whole lot of sharing of DNA around the globe, and so it's difficult just for, well, for origins reasons. You have to explain it, but that's an empirical finding. There are DNA sequences you will share with a Chinese man that you may not share with me. It's just the way the world is. And
well,
so
that's interesting. And that you asked that the question that Ken Ham asked at the beginning, have you been evolutionized? It's like, I think a lot of the world has been evolutionized because we tend to think, oh, that's going to be so different than me, and the African's going to be so different than the Chinese. It's really this whole thing back, which is really more of an evolutionary worldview versus the amount of shared DNA information. That's interesting.
Yeah. And it's a testament to how related we all are. So to answer the question the statement that opens our program here, here's one of the indirect evidences of how related we are. It's very difficult to unambiguously assign ethnicity. Are there signatures of ethnicity? Yes, but there's a whole lot of DNA that's just distributed all around the globe that frustrates this process. If your purpose is to say, let me find the signature of Cambodia or Korea or Nigeria, this is one of the first challenges you run into. Another thing you can see here is, in this slide, you can go from African, dark-skinned, to me, light-skinned, in the blink of an eye. So you want to look at, understand, if you want to understand human history, external appearances take you back maybe to your great-grandparents. They can take you back further if you have an unbroken family tree that's been maybe somewhat, for lack of a better term, inbred. But this is the big challenge facing any study of Adam and Eve. In one side, it's a nice confirmation that we all are very related and consistent with having a recent common ancestor. But the other side of it is trying to tease out the details of who we came from gets statistically challenging in just a few generations. So that's the first point I want to make, is you have to start looking for other types of DNA. So the reason this challenge exists is because we have two parents. We get DNA from both of them. And so the solution to this little conundrum is, let's go looking for DNA that only comes from one parent. And there's two types of DNA, or there's a small fraction of DNA that comes from only one parent, one only from moms, one only from dads. Most of our DNA is from both parents. We have mitochondrial DNA, technical term, but it's just what it is. Maternal DNA, basically. It's only about 16,000 letters long. It's a tiny, 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 tiny fraction of the total, but it's a tool that helps us avoid the problem we just encountered. The problem we just encountered was the DNA signal gets diluted by half every generation. Here's our problem. How do we get back to Adam and Eve? Well, signal gets diluted by half. Mitochondrial DNA does not. Comes from one parent, the other DNA gets diluted. So this mitochondrial DNA, that's the solution. That's one answer. We also have a record of our paternal history, and that's the Y chromosome that comes only through dads. So make a long story short, if we want to look for proof of Adam and Eve, confirmation of it, it's going to be tough to find it in the vast majority of our DNA. So by the way, just to put some numbers on this, about over 99% of our DNA comes from both parents.
Oh, wow.
So the vast majority of your DNA is tough to go back further than a few generations. And here's a dirty little secret. If you pay $100 for your Ancestry.com test, you're probably not going to learn much more beyond what you already know from your family tree.
Seriously, I always thought it was going to be I didn't do it, but I'm going, oh, yeah, you're going to get all this information. Okay.
And
good to know. Good to know.
Yeah. It's not like it's a deep, dark secret. It's just that the facts of basic biology. It's two parents. We all have two parents. And so that signal gets diluted. The way you can expand it further, and I think Ancestry.com might be run by Mormons, is if you get enough users using it who enter their family tree data, and you click, okay, I have DNA match to this cousin or second cousin. And so you can combine your tree with that person's tree and start connecting the trees that way. But that's not from your DNA test per se. It's not like you give your spit and voila, there's this magic solution. It's hard work of connecting smaller family trees and connecting the bigger ones. my point here with the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA is you can actually go back to the beginning, or as far as you can go in biblical history with these, because you don't get DNA signal dilution.
No
That's maybe
delusion.
more.
So it's literally like you got all this other DNA that's being split and crossed, and you got these two lines that are just kind of following all that all the way down consistently.
Yeah, and let me see if I got a slide for this. Here's how it works. Okay, here we go. So it's again, there's always two sides to this coin. Because every generation, then the Y chromosome only comes from one parent, my dad, who got it from his dad, who got it from his dad, and so forth. It allows you to go deep in history.
Wow.
But now look at this family tree here of mine. All those other branches I've grayed out, I don't learn about from my Y chromosome. I don't learn about my mother's relatives. There's indirect ways of doing this. The key concept with mitochondrial DNA and with Y chromosome DNA, or the undiluted DNA, maybe that's a better catch-all term. It only comes from one parent. Because we live in a fallen world, that DNA is copied imperfectly. So I think we mentioned cystic fibrosis. You can look at the DNA sequence and say, this has been, here's how it's supposed to work. Something has happened. There's an error that's been introduced in one section of the DNA. It's not mitochondrial, but just as an example of there's real world ramifications of this. Because of Adam's sin, you can see this at the DNA level. And those mistakes that occur act like ticks of a clock. So for mitochondrial DNA, it's about 1 every 6 to 10 generations. It's kind of a slow ticker.
Wow.
And so this is actually not entirely accurate, but I put it here just for illustration purposes. So I've got 1 generation. Here's an ancestor, then 2nd generation, 3rd, 4th, 5th. These are probably all identical in the real world. But just to show you that the principle behind it is these ticks of the clock add up. So males and females have mitochondrial DNA, by the way. It's just that only moms pass it on. My 4 children have my wife's mitochondrial DNA. I have my mother's. So I could compare my mitochondrial DNA to my wife's mitochondrial DNA to say, okay, when was our last maternal common ancestor? So if there's a lot of mitochondrial DNA differences between me and my wife, our maternal ancestor is deep in the past. There's been lots of the ticks of the clock. If there's only a few differences, then maybe I married a closer relative than I thought. And
I love it.
That's highly likely for reasons we can get into later. It has to do with human population growth. And then for the Y chromosome. So just to put a conclusion to this, you can take the number of DNA differences from ladies, men around the globe, the mitochondrial DNA differences, their maternally inherited DNA, on average is about, in non-African peoples, there's about 40 mitochondrial DNA differences. So me and you probably have a average of 40 differences between us. If you have Northern European descent, which my mitochondrial DNA is, we might only be about 20 differences apart. But the point is it's small.
Wow.
And among Africans, it's about twice that, about 80 mitochondrial DNA differences. So we know how many total there are. We know how fast this clock ticks. So you can say, how long ago did that first ancestor live? And here's the quote we had discussed before the program.
I love this.
When it was
This is
first
cool.
sequenced in 1997, this was actually a part of the mitochondrial DNA where they just got mothers, daughters, grandmothers, granddaughters, something like that, people of known genealogical relationship. Got their mitochondrial DNA sequence, compared it, counted it. So this isn't rocket science, it's just counting it. How many differences occur every generation? Now you got the ticks of the clock. That's how we got to this idea. That's one of the first steps towards getting towards this idea of 1 mistake, 1 tick of the clock every 6 to 10 generations. The evolutionary community recognized that this clock ticked way too fast. She would have lived a mere 6,000 years ago. So as you might imagine, this sparked a firestorm of criticism and debate for at least the next decade. It's still a debated topic. What I've done, some of the papers I've published, have taken the raw data from the is it up to 15 studies now? There's been a bunch of studies looking at mothers and daughters because, again, the implications for evolution are very stark. If you look at all the raw data, combine it all, that result still holds. The mitochondrial DNA clock points towards an origin about 6,000 years ago. That's not been overturned despite rigorous attempts to do so.
And it's going too fast for the evolution worldview, but it literally works out perfect for the creation worldview.
Exactly.
I
And
mean,
I
I sit back and I go, the genius of God to go, you know what? I'm going to do this on the mom's side. Just as they're not going to learn about this till the end of time, but man, I'm just going to give them this little piece of information that one day they're going to discover and have as evidence. I created the heavens and the earth, and I made Adam and Eve just like I said I did. Beautiful. Dr. Jeanson, you've dedicated your life now to this. I can't help but think how laborsome and how rewarding it is at the same time to be able to see these truths and then to be able to present these to the world. So from myself, and I'm sure everybody watching, thank you for dedicating your life to understanding this truth and presenting it to the world. We appreciate that. This is exciting. We're at the precipice of brand new things happening. Now, we know the world is going to continue to either ignore, like we saw in those studies, ignore this truth or suppress this truth. So you're right, this really is interesting and fascinating information. It points to the absolute truth of God and His Word. So I couldn't be more excited about this.